Welcome to the first episode of the Self-Wired Book Club. Today we'll be going over The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel von der Kolk. This book's about the impact of trauma on mental health and how we can go about healing trauma in our daily lives. The book starts off with some pretty mind-blowing statistics regarding the prevalence of trauma in our societies. So we're going to kick it off by reading those off here. Do we have those on?
Yeah, we have them in the prologue, and from this, this data from the CDC, and if I can, actually, I can go to it right now, right here. So if you look at the CDC data, it's easy to see how trauma is a continually growing phenomenon in the health sphere because, again, this goes back to our first podcast, not a book discussion, our podcast, where we're talking about how we're seeing a trend towards holistic protocols, towards understanding the human as a whole, how it functions, body in relation to mind and mind in relation to body, how everything is integrated, and psychological trauma, which is the main focus of Kolk's work. We start to see how that takes toll on, all aspects of the human. And with stuff like this data, it's easy to see how trauma is, how people can become traumatized. And so it's just a great way to it's a good intro to the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because these are hopefully not too many people can relate to these statistics, but I think everyone has experienced trauma to some degree, whether that be, bullying in high school or something much more severe than this. And, the prevalence of substance abuse in everyday life and how that impacts a child's upbringing. It's pretty staggering to look at something like, 1 in 3 engage in physical violence, 1 in 4 have alcoholic relatives. It runs rampant, and it's something that a lot of people don't necessarily have the opportunity to go through and talk with someone about. Unless they get a counselor or some kind of mental health professional to help them work through the trauma. So the beautiful thing about this book is that it's going to go into what the individual can do to help themselves. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the book in terms of getting into the applicable steps we can take to begin to heal our own trauma from the body up or the top down, like what he gets into. And we'll talk about that more in later slides.
I think that's the most important, or one of the most important parts about why we're discussing this book, is that growing responsibility to that desire to heal ourselves. Because in order to heal ourselves optimally, in order to heal optimally, a large part of that will stem from individual responsibility in taking that desire to heal, to get better upon yourself. You can only delegate so much of that to external sources, and at some point in the healing process, we have to learn as individuals to heal, and how we go about that process. Healers are there, and this is true. It's like the same way in which a good teacher is designed. It should help others to become better self-educators, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily that we have to do it all alone. A lot of it comes down to your own individual efforts. But if you can learn a little bit about psychology and learn a little bit about the way that trauma impacts people, you can help those around you. Because I guarantee if you're not traumatized, someone very close to you is, and you can be there for them if you understand what's going on in their own psychology.
sorry, as human beings, kind of going off what you're saying, as human beings, we experience trauma to some degree. No one's perfect in their experience. Um, we all perceive events in our lives as somewhat traumatic, depending on the individual. Something has happened to us that has shaped our minds and our bodies in a perhaps negative way. And so this book is for everyone in that sense, in that it's going about that healing process and learning the dynamics of trauma, of psychological trauma, and its influences on the body, and how we can look in the roots of the body to bring about that healing. Let's backtrack a little bit here, and to backtrack, go back to this quote, kind of kick off the book. And the quote reads, "The greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves." Landon, when you read that, what do you think of that? What do you make in relation to, how does that relate to this book?
So when we're discussing trauma, a lot of the time a traumatic event is something that you don't want to face. You wish it wasn't the way it is. So you repress that event, or you repress the feelings associated with the event, and that can lead to a lot of issues in everyday life. Unless you pull out the traumatic event from the depths of your memory and you face it head on, they will kind of run your life. And if you're lying to yourself and you're saying that everything's fine when you haven't faced whatever trauma it is, the trauma will kind of take on a life of its own, and it'll run your life from the shadows. So
And it's like how Carl Jung said that in a different quote. He said that um, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And so it's kind of what this is about. Is, I guess you could say, these lies we tell ourselves are these unconscious events that have happened to us that remain autonomic within us, and they kind of have become an automatic part of us because we're not addressing how we feel in certain situations. We're not addressing why we respond in a way. And that can be seen as either top-down therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, but it also can be seen as bottom-up therapy in the case of this book, where we're simply taking an observation of the body and its reaction to stimuli in certain environments, to certain stimuli. Let's go ahead and talk briefly about the author of this book, Bessel van der Kolk, MD, the medical doctor. Bessel is a Dutch psychiatrist, and his story, his origins in terms of his youth, pertain well to this book and why I guess he became a part of this field. If you listen to him talk, and even I believe in the introduction as well, he talks a bit about this, how he noticed this recurring pattern of trauma that took place through his father, not only his father, but through those around him, where they would hold on to trauma and repeat the very things that caused them that trauma originally. His dad was a survivor of the concentration camps in World War II, and although you would think that someone surviving such a harsh condition and being exposed to such an environment would seek to be the opposite of that, what Kolk saw in his father was it was almost as though Kolk's father had become the Nazi had become like the Nazi soldiers, in the sense that he became very domineering and very, I don't want to say rageful, but he became very angry, hot-tempered, and in a sense, he became the thing that you would think to avoid after experiencing an event like that. But it seemed that traumatic event seemed to replay his father, and his father would continue to enact the patterns that arose from being in a concentration camp. And Kolk saw this in early patients as well, and that kind of, I guess, led him down the rabbit hole of understanding how this instantiates in us physiologically and just the dynamics psychobiologically, how trauma works.
Right. And I think it's a testament to Kolk himself that he experienced and he grew up with people that were suffering from PTSD. And at the time, there wasn't the diagnosis of PTSD to put these angry outbursts into a framework and understand them. And so for him to grow up and be one of the pioneering research in the field of trauma and the way that affects not only the individual that's traumatized, but the family members that they are surrounded by. So it's I think it's really beautiful that he took that trauma that he grew up with and that he was exposed to as a young child and turned that into a career and helped change a lot of people's lives. And yeah, it's a testament to his character, I think.
Right. Yes. Absolutely. Now we talked about the prologue, or we talked about this data specifically, talking about how we can see the prevalence of trauma and how common this may be to a greater or less degree. Regardless, trauma is a growing phenomenon, like we said before. It is a growing phenomenon in the health sphere and in addressing how to go about healing someone in their entirety. So we talked about that. And this I thought was really cool because he talks about the three fundamental ideas when Kolk was studying healing trauma or dealing with pathology, psychopathology. There were three methods typically that had been established. And as you can see, the one being top down, which is psychotherapy, that's like we said, CBT, that is addressing your thoughts and addressing actions, addressing events and why you feel a certain way, and addressing why you think a certain way in certain scenarios. And then the second was pharmacological intervention, and that was kind of had been developing throughout Kolk's early career, especially psychopharmacology, which I believe is, and Kolk also seems to believe that as the dominating paradigm in healing psychology or healing pathologies, although that paradigm seems to be shifting. So we have top-down therapy, pharmacological intervention, i.e. prescription medications, stuff like that. And the third one is the focus of the book, which is bottom up. Instead of looking at, think of it like a tree, instead of looking at the top and seeing the branches dying and thinks, well, why is that the case? And then we begin to look down into the roots. First, what we do is we get into the root system, which is like it's funny how this illustration plays out in relation to our physiology, because think about roots, for example. Roots are under the ground, and you can think of that as being their unconscious. That's because these roots, being under the ground and being unconscious, they belong to the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system is every nerve that surround or runs through the body, not the central nervous system. You could think of the central nervous system as like the trunk and the branches, whereas the roots of the tree are in the body. And so that's kind of what we're getting at here, is the body therapy, looking at the body first.
Right. And an important characteristic is of bottom up is not just necessarily like the physical body. Well, that's a huge part of this paradigm, and it's obvious from the title, but also reconnecting with your emotions. Because I might be alone in this, but emotions are experienced kind of in your gut, So you start from the bottom and you feel these emotions, and then from those emotions you attempt to cognitively understand them, as opposed to intellectualizing about the emotions. You feel the emotions and then from there move up to a more the upper regions of your mind in order to rationally understand them.
Yeah, you're certainly not alone in that, I would say. That's why, for example, you can see a lot of stress and psychological pathology or things that may occur from a psychic origin tend to manifest in something like IBS or some sort of um, digestive discomfort, gut discomfort. And that is because of that fact that our emotions, like you said, are relegated to the body, to the roots of ourselves. And like, yeah, you phrased it pretty well, where we're allowing these emotions to come up and we're feeling what it is and trying, I guess, and trying to understand in a better way why we feel that way. And that's kind of a blend of top down and bottom up. And we also have to include the pharmacological intervention, because as I have another, you can see here that Kolk also said that usually the best way to heal people is using a combination of the three. And that's like an interesting illustration, because that is the illustration or the symbol of the philosopher's stone, where you have, like, it's this right here, a triangle or a circle inside a triangle. So you have these three entities of healing, these three entities of these three entities of medicine, like top-down therapy, bottom-up pharmacology. And the best typically is a blend of the three, unifying them, because the human organism is multifaceted. So it's not like one of these are just going to work entirely for somebody, whereas one works for another person. Typically, generally, the rule is that typically the combination of the three works best. Now, that isn't to say there are exceptions, and typically someone is just missing one aspect, so they just need that. Do you get what I'm saying?
Right. Well, it's if someone's emotions are too much for them to handle, they need to be dampened down. We're going to get into the idea of flashbacks. When you're, say you're a Vietnam veteran and you're attempting to understand the trauma that is currently ruling your life, and every time you attempt to tap into the emotion and recall the memory, you're thrust back into the environment that originally caused you the trauma. You're not going to be able to help yourself. It's too much for an individual to handle if they're consistently back in an environment of war and violence. So to dampen that down a little bit, that it's a beautiful gift that psychology has found. Take an overactive amygdala and lower the volume a little bit, and then suddenly you can approach the issue safely.
Yeah, take that Vietnam veteran, that Kolk. That was early in his research. He worked in the VA and he worked with Vietnam veterans in his early work. And so take that example you just gave. Well, think of the three methods here. So a top-down method to helping that person would be to sit them down and to ask them a series of questions, or to get them to question themselves, to go through a cascade of questions about why they might respond certain ways in their environment, in their current environment, and what that may have manifested from. And then they can maybe get to the root of, well, it stemmed from this initial event of you saw your friend get blown up in a platoon. And then you take pharmacological intervention, which is mainly, okay, we see that usually in traumatized people, they have depleted serotonin, hence why they usually prescribe SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, to increase brain serotonin. And so that would be another method. And then the bottom up therapy is you introduce the stimulus or something in their environment that causes them that kind of shifts them into that initial state, and you allow them to feel the stimulus, and based upon how they're responding, why is it that they're fearful, and why is it that they're angry, or they can feel their emotions swelling from the stimulus, and then that process of asking the questions, or supplementing with certain drugs might come into play. But essentially, it's a combination of the three that typically works best. Now we're getting into part one, the rediscovery of trauma. So again, like we said, he worked with Vietnam veterans. And again, so this PTSD being a term coined in 1980 kind of goes to show how Kolk was in this field at a time when it was just emerging. His work, I believe, what was it, in the late 60s and 70s when he first began working in psychology, is that correct?
Yeah, he was, that's when he was still in school, I believe, and he was mostly just helping out and learning underneath the people that were running these institutions.
Okay, yeah, exactly. And anyways, he's assessing PTSD in these veterans that he worked with at the VA. And what they would do is he would use a Rorschach blot test, which is this blot test that you typically associate with psychologists. If you think like a stereotypical psychologist, they're showing you this blot test and they're saying, what do you see here? And there's a value in that. And the value is that you put into the blot whatever it is you perceive. It kind of allows you to project things from your psyche into your external environment. And so that's kind of exactly what Kolk was doing with these, was he was looking at people that would be diagnosed with PTSD, these Vietnam veterans who had experienced very intense things in Vietnam. They would superimpose their trauma. So they would look into the picture and they would see, I believe, for example, they said they would see their platoon members getting obliterated by machine guns or something along those lines. It would be something occurring stemming from the initial traumatic event. And that leads into the quote below that says, trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. And so this Rorschach blot test was allowing Kolk to see that trauma fundamentally changes your perceptions of your external environment. And why is that important? Well, if you listen to the future podcasts Landon and I will do regarding placebo, and even the last podcast we did talking about the power of the internal state, we know that your perception of your environment largely is what creates is what creates the environment, and is also what regulates your own internal physiology.
The important thing that that was an aspect of this Rorschach blot test is Kolk went into, I don't remember the exact words he used, but essentially the imagination of the traumatized individual is hijacked. So that you're supposed to use your imagination to give life to these blots. And so you see that the imagination is no longer working correctly, where someone might see, say, a butterfly, the individual who is overcome with a traumatic memory sees the memory. And another interesting side note was he went into the work he did in a psych ward where he was working with schizophrenics. And you can think of schizophrenia essentially as an individual absorbed by their imagination. So they're hallucinating as if they're dreaming while they're awake. And one thing that he noted was that a lot of their hallucinations were resorted to the initial trauma. So they would be hallucinating the voice of the person who had traumatized them, or seeing the individual, and reenacting the initial traumatic event.
Right. They were consumed by their trauma.
Mhm.
Um, and that consumption of their trauma created a mismatch between their internal and external state. It's like Kolk will go into this later, but it's essentially a problem of mindfulness, of being stuck in the past, and you're not you're not living properly in relation to your present environment.
Exactly.
So, and this was another quote that I thought was interesting, because it's just an interesting point of speculation when you're looking at the origins of trauma, how trauma seems to manifest itself. The quote reads, "Somehow the very event that caused them so much pain had also become their sole source of meaning. They felt fully alive only when they were revisiting their traumatic past." So why is it that this trauma had assumed all meaning in these individuals' lives? Because you take a Vietnam veteran raised in a time when, like, a time of new age, the hippie movement. You have a lot of revolutions in understanding, I guess, kind of revolutions in consciousness almost, um, where there's a lot of developing ideas regarding around, in the use, the heavy use of psychedelics certainly played a role into this. And there's like a disillusion almost in the culture of meaning, of a faith in um, any supernatural phenomena, faith in God, and higher power. And so this trauma, assuming so much meaning in these people's lives, is that a manifestation of an initial lack of meaning or purpose that preceded the event.
Right, and it makes sense that it would be the greatest event that happened in their life. I mean, the event that caused them the most intense emotion would be the thing that they resorted to in terms of understanding the world. So once that initial event is something as traumatizing as seeing your best friend killed, that is what you understand the world to be. And it doesn't matter if later on that trauma is no longer present. That's still the greatest emotion that you've ever experienced. That's the lens through which you're experiencing the world. That's the thing you resort back to in terms of understanding the existential questions that we all struggle with, of what is it that we're doing here. And so if what it is that we're doing here is something as traumatic as going to war, then what you extrapolate from that's not going to be positive at all.
Right, and look at this guy Tom. That was Kolk's patient. Um, I believe this was Tom. This might have been another patient actually, but he was a veteran, and it was almost like when they were given the opportunity to take a drug that would maybe help relieve their nightmares, they wanted to keep having their nightmares and remain almost with the trauma, because it was almost like um, a living on of their comrades from war. Like their comrades would live on through them. I believe that's what he said.
Right.
And it's almost like there was something noble in holding on to their trauma. So it's like it was a meaning that, as terrible the event was, it was a meaning that they felt profound enough to hold on to. Um, and maybe that's special to the context of trauma that occurs in war, given the I mean the camaraderie developed in war between brothers. Oops, I'm going backwards here. So yeah, maybe that's just special to the context of war. However, you do see. I mean, this does play into the idea that traumatized individuals play out their trauma over and over again. They bring it up in their lives over and over again, even though they may it's something that they never wish to have been uh, had happened to them in the first place.
Right, because in comparison to everyday life, it was so much more extreme. So it's hard for someone to come back to baseline after uh, emotions and events as extreme as the things that they went through.
Right, and it's another way to think about this is like in think about in ancient Greece or Rome and or in ancient cultures in general where a religious fervor was so strong in their warriors. Um, it wasn't like their trauma was almost. You would think that their trauma was almost inhibited, so to speak, by a belief in their gods or goddesses or God. Um, it was that knowledge, it was that knowing of something beyond themselves that gave them sort of a resolution and gave them almost a mental, psychological fortitude in such a intense environment. And something that we don't experience now because we've had a dissolution of understanding what our place is in the universe.
That's interesting. What came to mind when you said that was Mayan culture, where they would, in religious um, environments, sacrifice millions and millions of people over the course of decades. But it was refined in the context of sacrifice to the gods. So, I mean, when you look at PTSD, it's not necessarily witnessing the event that someone else did. You know, the something that someone did to you. A lot of the time, it's what you did to someone else. So it's interesting that these sacrifices that we can look through history and see, and all the wars throughout history, they never talk about PTSD per se, because it's I guess you could argue it's refined inside the context of the culture.
Right, and it's also something to think about that is the warriors of those cultures. Typically, there was no integrating in the society in the same way a warrior today has to, because all of our wars have been fought in like a different land, and we haven't. That isn't a part of us. Whereas a warrior of of past times would have fought, and there would be no need to integrate almost because they were expected to fight until they either died or they were killed in war.
Right. And
So,
obviously this is slight conjecture on our part, but I
mm-hmm.
think there's a lot to be said about the difference in the lack of violence and the differences in just basic culture today. That's it makes sense that because it's so different today, these people can't come back from something as extreme as war and then integrate themselves into everyday life easily.
Right, because although past cultures have been experienced to such or have been exposed to so much stuff that would have traumatized people today, our development in the course of our own personal lifetimes, our like epigenetic development, if you think about it biologically, our personal development in this short amount of time in Western culture, it has allowed for us. It's dampened, in a sense, our ability to, or not our ability to, but it's dampened. We don't need to experience the huge amounts of traumatic events that we would have if we lived 500, 600, 700 years ago, or in beyond that and before that.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, the society that we're a part of isn't compatible with the kind of violence that previous generations saw. There's a mismatch between our environment and the experience of the individual that's traumatized.
Yeah. Yes. Um, and this goes on into like making sense, how to, after experiencing the trauma, how do you make sense of the suffering? So this is kind of almost getting into, this is a foreshadowing into the healing process of that trauma. And this is a quote from the book: people can never get better without knowing what they know and feeling what they feel. And in the case of this book, that is, again, going to the body, resorting to the body, understanding why it feels the way it feels in certain environments.
Right. And then the learned helplessness. What that's referring to is a famous study in psychology, that it wouldn't fly today, but back in the day when there was less strict protocol, they essentially put a dog in a sort of box, and this dog couldn't escape while it was being electrocuted. Um, and then they shifted the box so there was the capacity for the dog to escape once it was electrocuted. And what they found was when the dogs had experienced not being able to escape, they didn't try to escape later on. And then when they took a control group of dogs, electrocuted them once, and um, to see if they would attempt to escape, they obviously escaped immediately into an area where they would not be electrocuted. So that's a very profound and famous study in psychology because it shows, obviously the name, we can learn to become helpless. What we learn from our environment shapes our response to that environment. So if we learn that our environment is treacherous, we don't just forget that easily. We take that with us throughout life.
It's not only that we don't forget it, even when we're given the opportunity to escape from that, we don't, it's not necessarily that people will escape. And that's why this is important to tie in here, because Kolk points out that the only way to get these dogs that have been traumatized from the electrical shock, in order to have them remove themselves from the trauma, the electric shock, was to physically remove them, to have them feel in their bodies a cessation of the electricity instead of just laying in it and kind of kind of accepting that this is now the reality and there's no possibility for change, even though the door was open and they were perfectly able to walk out and to leave and to remove the stressor.
Right. So we learn to be helpless, but we can also relearn what it feels like to get help, which I think is really important. Later on, we'll talk about Kolk's understanding of how humans have the ability to help one another, and we tend to kind of forget this, but we're able to do it. And as traumatic as the world is, our capacity to help those around us is very strong, and we're proving that more and more as psychology matures.
Yeah, it's matched. Our capacity to heal one another is matched by our capacity to hurt one another. Um, you kind of made this slide, so I'll let you kind of riff on what you were thinking here.
So what Kolk goes into is the way in which trauma establishes a new chemical balance within the individual who's traumatized. So he began to notice that these veterans that he was speaking to would a pattern throughout all these patients of his were things like riding their motorcycle at hundreds of miles an hour, or drinking themselves into a stupor, getting into fights, skydiving, risk-taking behavior. There was an impulse to recreate the intensity of the initial trauma. And so he compared this to something like a drug tolerance, where you take a drug and that drug establishes a new form of chemicals within your brain. That's why you do it. And then your body adapts to that. So you need more in order to establish that same feeling. So essentially, these people were in a way going through withdrawal. They were going through the withdrawal of the adrenaline that they had initially experienced, and they wanted to reinvent that same feeling as if they were addicted to a drug.
Right, and he talks about also how this is kind of similar to when someone becomes addicted to exercising or sauna, or there's an initial and I hope I'm saying this right. It's almost, think of it like hormesis. There's an initial stressor, but past that initial stressor, there's a feeling of you feel better afterwards, after the endorphin release, and that can apply whether it be with something typically assumed as positive like exercising or cold or heat therapy, um, you know, fighting a sport, or like partaking in any like intense sport, rock climbing, whatever it may be. You build up a tolerance of it, and you get used to it, so you have to do more of it.
Mhm.
And that also includes with what we know of alcohol and smoking, habits. We tolerate this. We become more tolerant to it chemically, and
Right.
over time we experience withdrawal to a greater or lesser degree, depending on if we're looking at alcohol or smoking versus something like exercise. You'll feel a withdrawal if you exercise intensely and then for a long time, and then you let off.
Right.
And there's like that fear. There's a fear of withdrawal, of the withdrawal symptoms, and less of like a need to experience that great feeling, that sense of euphoria. So even in reenacting the trauma, it's not that you're enacting it to feel the pleasure. You're enacting it out of fear of feeling the withdrawal, the abandonment of the sensation.
Right. And not even necessarily the withdrawal, but the emptiness of it not being there. And this kind of goes back to neural plasticity. While they were in the traumatic event, their brains adapted to what their brain thought that was the new environment. So it changed its chemical levels to match that environment. Then that environment goes away quickly, but that the same new balance is still there. So that, again, we're seeing a mismatch between what their brain is expecting in their environment and the environment they find themselves in, which is typically one of boredom. And these people would report feeling empty unless they were attempting to re-engage and get that hit.
It's almost like that cliche of you'd rather feel pain than nothing at all. You'd rather feel something rather than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you talked about the book Livewire by David Eagleman, and what you're saying kind of goes right with that, in that the brain is very plastic in its development. So especially if you're exposed to trauma early as a child, and your brain is so plastic that it's very easily shaped and informed by its environment. So at an earlier age, you're more adaptive to a trauma, to experience a trauma, and to have that manifest in your physiology than, say, if you're older. However, being younger, that also gives you the capacity to relieve yourself of that trauma. But that also carries with it the fact that children aren't typically as developed in their consciousness, so it's a lot harder to kind of have a psychotherapy session with a child and have them relieve themselves of trauma.
Right.
So, although in a way, and this kind of gets into a different conversation, a child is much more akin to an animal in the sense that it's not as conscious. It's more rooted in its body, children are. And so this is like in the book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which might be a good book for us to read. It kind of talks about how animals can kind of naturally, they know how to rid themselves of traumatic events and to maintain a homeostasis, a proper balance, equilibrium. So that's something to think about, to consider as well. This is a study that Kolk and some colleagues had conducted, which showed the fact that strong emotions can actually inhibit pain, and that this is one idea of this is one speculation as to why people would want to reenact their trauma or revisit a traumatic event. So quickly, I'll read you the study with the details. So you had 8 Vietnam veterans watch 2 movie clips while holding a hand in ice cold water. One of the clips was from a graphic war film called Platoon. It's set in the Vietnam War. So that film was supposed to reenact a sense of being in that initial environment, that traumatic environment, to the veterans. And while the other clip was, quote, peaceful and long forgotten. And what Kolk found was that 7 out of 8 of the veterans held their hand in water 30% longer when they were watching the war film. And that's because he proposed that war film and that, I guess, return to the trauma had as equal an analgesic effect, it relieved pain, as well as dosing 8 milligrams of morphine. Mm-hmm. What did you think about that? He also said that this is another reason why this might happen is because having that analgesic effect helps to dampen the excited nature of their anxiety from PTSD.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting to break down the word endorphin. What that word means is endogenous morphine. So there's again.
I never thought of it like that. That's important to point out.
Yeah, that's if you break down the etymology of the word, that's where it comes from. Is we have these endogenous chemicals in our body that in a lot of instances are not being used. I mean, this is why people get a quote runner's high, because there is a release of these feel-good chemicals, and we crave that feeling. So it kind of goes back to the previous slide of having withdrawals and comparing some of these events to someone who abuses drugs. It's there's a certain amount of craving for that chemical release that the majority of us don't necessarily have that craving because we haven't gotten that hit from a traumatic event. But once that new chemical balance is established within the body, there's a desire to repeat it, and you see that in a physiological example with this study.
Yeah, and this just goes to play. This plays into the efficacy of pharmacological intervention, of why we can see growing addictions with prescription medications, because we see the body is composed of chemicals. We're biochemical entities. We're beings in nature. Biochemistry is the underlying, almost the fundamental understanding of how we function. You can get underneath that as like biophysics, and that's even a growing field of interest and very very interesting stuff. But so this is why Kolk was he saw much promise in pharmacology and psychopharmacology, and he was an advocate or an enthusiast of it when this first began developing in the case for PTSD, for treating PTSD. This is a picture of fluoxetine, which is the SSRI, the most famous SSRI. And essentially what it's supposed to do is increase brain serotonin, because they found low serotonin was associated with a hyperactive amygdala, whereas a higher serotonin helped to dampen the amygdala response. And the amygdala is an area of the brain that's responsible for evoking emotions. So with a hyperactive amygdala, which you would see in PTSD and also anxiety and depression, with a hyperactive amygdala, you have these neurotic tendencies. However, with this was fluoxetine was created essentially in the hopes to increase serotonin, dampen this response, and allow people to feel more calm or at ease. Something that Kolk said even when he called, I believe it was Eli Lilly, the company, he called Eli Lilly after giving fluoxetine to some of his patients and seeing impressive results. He called them and he gave this quote, which says that you've created a drug that helps people to be in the present moment. And that was something that we were speaking to earlier, where there's a mismatch between our bodies, or in the case of traumatic people, their bodies are set in the past when in fact their current environment has them set in a totally different atmosphere. They're at home with their families. They're not in the trenches fighting someone with machine guns.
Yeah, the one side note that really stood out to me, it almost gave me chills reading the book. He was talking about a patient of his who suffered from, I believe the term is bulimia, where they eat copious amounts of food and then they make themselves throw up afterwards. They do this all day in severe cases. And he found a prescription that worked for one of his patients, and she came forward and went, "That was amazing. I spent the day eating when I was hungry, and the rest of the time I did my schoolwork." And he spoke about how that was one of the most powerful encounters he's had with someone. Because what you're seeing is someone who's been suffering, and they've been suffering for a long time with an extreme compulsion to do something that's very harmful to their body. And then they went, now I can be a normal human being. And it's amazing that we have these things that can turn someone who's reenacting this, not reenacting, but continuously doing this horrible thing to themselves, and that's a result of an abnormality in their brain, and then they can take a pill once a day and have that go away. It's amazing.
Yes, but the problem with that is that over time it seems like that idea has dominated the medical industry, and Kolk notices too, where people began to denigrate all pathologies to a means of chemical imbalance. Hence why people, when they become sick or they feel there's something wrong with them, they turn to pills.
Mm-hmm.
And Kolk saw this and began to saw, I guess, an imbalance between those three methods that we talked about before: top-down therapy, bottom-up therapy, and pharmacological intervention. He began to see a growing trend for this pharmacological intervention,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's threw the balance out of it's throwing the balance out of whack. Not that there's ever a true balance. There's always a means to balance one with the other. One will dominate over the other, and that's just the nature of how of going about anything, of any system. Is anything living has to continually balance itself throughout its life. Like, imbalance is inherent in any living system. But anyways, as time went on, Kolk saw these problems, and drugs began to displace therapy, and they're not getting to the root causes, which is what we're trying to look at, what Kolk's trying to look at, the root cause, the bottom up, getting down there, and from that, seeing why you're not seeing any health where in the conscious sphere. You're not seeing health on the branches because something's wrong with the roots.
Right. This is what's referred to as the disease model of psychology. And essentially, someone comes to you and say they're traumatized. And as a result of the trauma, they have an immense amount of negative emotion, as well as some compulsions, like, say, bulimia, to use that example. the the initial impulse of today is to quickly categorize them into a diagnosis and then write a prescription. And while that works in some cases, in a lot of cases, like he's saying, if you're not getting to the root of the problem and you're not exposing the trauma, there's not going to be any kind of true healing and increase in perspective and insight that will come out of that. You're essentially putting a band-aid over it. That's not to say that these medications aren't great and that they don't help a lot of people, but like we were saying, if they aren't used in conjunction with these other methods that psychology has, these top-down and bottom-up approaches, that's a huge loss, and the individual doesn't have the opportunity to truly heal.
Right, and maybe I should have included this in this slide to better illustrate this, but that's a problem. This is like the problem of isolation versus integration, and we could talk about that some other point, where think of, if you know a tensegrity structure, think of a tensegrity structure. It is this almost like a jungle, think of like a jungle gym where you have this structure. It could be a ball, it could be whatever, where it's all of these points that are connected, or all of these sticks that are connected in some integral way to one another. So you have like one stick here, and it's wrapped to like a stick over here, and it's like a big. The point of it is to show that affecting one area of the tensegrity structure will cascade and affect everything else. So essentially, what these drugs are doing is they're looking at one mechanism in the body and the brain, and they're seeking to change the balance of that, the equilibrium of that. Well, like we said, if you change one point of that structure, because the tensegrity structure is equivalent to the human and how it functions, if you affect one of those points, you're going to have a cascade of other side effects. And these are focused, they're very isolated to focus on one thing when you have 10 other side effects. And that's one problem of pharmacology. However, again, like we're saying, Kolk showed or had seen efficacy in these things. It's just that there was an overemphasis of it. And so medications began to, I believe he said that like cubicles in the hospital he worked at, there were basketball courts where he would be with patients, and they replaced that with cubicles. And there was a new laboratory they put in place of, I believe it was
swimming pools.
Yeah, a swimming pool. So they put new laboratories where there used to be swimming pools. So people are getting out of their bodies more and more, and they're allocating all of their problems to a means of chemical imbalance. These are some statistics about pharmacology and its dominance in its financial dominance. So you can see here, antipsychotic drugs were the top selling in the U.S. And Abilify and Cymbalta, which are two antipsychotic drugs, Abilify accrued the most money, more than any other medication, in 2012, and Cymbalta was number 3 top selling. So 1 in 3 top selling drugs in the US were antipsychotic medications. And also he goes into detail about Medicaid, how it spends the most money on antipsychotics, and there's a $2 billion growth in revenue from 1999 to 2008.
Right. There's a statistic like 1 in 10 people are on antidepressants, but there's been a 2/3 fold increase in people seeking psychiatric care for depression. So while the prescriptions are going up and the diagnoses are going up, in terms of from a cultural viewpoint, the depression is on a rise. So while we should be seeing it decreasing with more diagnoses and greater numbers of people being medicated, we're actually seeing an increase in depression. So it's great in a lot of cases. At the same time, there's a lot of cases where it's unnecessary, and even lacks proper use.
Right. And this is just going back, and I just wanted to highlight this real quick, just so we have an understanding of what we were talking about before. So this is a tensegrity structure. And again, going back to how pills work. So take this point on this stick that I'm looking at. All these sticks are connected to each other by ropes or wires, and they all form to make this one structure. And you can think of this whole structure as a human being. Well, when you affect this certain pressure point, this leverage point, what you're doing is you're affecting the tension to some degree in every single other spot around here. Now, it might not be significant enough to cause you to not take the medication. However, that isn't to say that in every case of illness, we require a chemical imbalance, we require medications. And in fact, a lot of the times we don't. We require, more approaches that something like Kolk, who's actually a psychiatrist, which is important to point out because someone who prescribes medications even ascribes to returning to more fundamental principles of healing, such as being more connected with the body. But so, yeah, that was just something that was on my mind. I just wanted to make sure that point was highlighted because I thought that was important.
Yeah, I mean, you can't separate one aspect of an individual out. You need to take a holistic point of view, which is hard because human beings are incredibly complicated. And like you were pointing out, each part of them is connected to other parts. But if you attempt to break them down and take a reductionist point of view in terms of their psychology, there's going to be backlash in other aspects of the individual.
Right. So we've hashed on the pharmacology of it. And this was when we were talking about the disease model earlier. These are sort of the problems that Kolk has with the disease model, these 4 fundamental problems. And, you can read them right there. Was there any that stood out to you in particular, Landon? For me, it was both number 1 and number 3, because number 1 it ties in well with the idea that a tree cannot reach to heaven unless its roots reach to hell. And I keep using tree metaphors here, so that's because I think we're inherently connected with our external environment. So we're designed in a very similar way to how nature has designed other organisms. So
yeah,
I think
number 1 it's beautiful to me because we were talking when we were getting ready to do this podcast, and we were kind of taking kind of a philosophical approach to what he was saying. And I pointed out that the people are coming in, and a lot of the times they have been traumatized by other humans. So, in the example of someone being molested, it was a human being that ruined their life, and it's a human being that caused them great amounts of suffering. But at the same time, they're coming to another human being in order to be healed. And it's beautiful to point out that, as it's important not to take a cynical approach to humans, because humans are the ones doing all the healing as well as a good chunk of the destruction.
correct. Yes, I think it illustrates that quote perfectly. Number 3, number 3 says we can regulate our physiology, including autonomic processes, through basic physical means. This is breathing, moving, and touching. Autonomic means it's automatic. It happens whether or not you're conscious of it. However, becoming conscious of it, we can better control our autonomic processes. And, through breathing, through moving, through touching, which are basically the fundamentals of body therapy, which we'll get into later on in this book. These are the underlying bedrock on which the healing methods stand. Regulating our physiology, becoming more mindful of our breathing when we're stressed, becoming more mindful of the fact that our heart's increasing when, when someone says a particular thing to us or acts in a particular manner towards us, even though they might have just burned some potatoes. You might overreact to that, and you might get extremely angry and ready to fight. You get engaged in fight or flight mode, because that is one of the core symptoms, or the manifestations of a traumatic event, is that when you experience stimuli that recall that traumatic event to you, even though it's not consciously happening, you're not thinking about the traumatic event when you see it, but the stimuli it stimulates your autonomic nervous system, your breathing, your heart rate, your digestion, and it prepares you for a state of fight or flight, which is the activation of your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight mode.
Right. I think number 3, to me at least, highlights the disease model beautifully, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand that in some degrees they have control over their autonomic processing, and you can understand emotions in the light of an autonomic process. And so in some cases, like in the case of someone with PTSD, they don't necessarily have control over their emotions. But for the rest of us, the people that are, only relatively traumatized, it to a large degree, we can, and this is something we learn as we're growing older, we can take control over our emotions. And that's something that you have to practice and you have to learn how to do. Early on in the book, Kolk described how these war veterans that were coming in had similar symptoms to his 3-year-old at home who was throwing temper tantrums. And that comparison, I think, is beautiful, because that they're essentially struggling with the same thing, which is being overcome by an autonomic process of anger, for example. So this anger takes them over, hijacks their cognition and their rationality. And like you were explaining, say someone burns dinner, that's the end of the world, we're fighting, and it's a process of learning to take control over emotional responses, and like meditation, or he uses the example of yoga, learning to breathe mindfully and move mindfully shows you and allows you to practice having control over these processes that are in a lot of cases unconscious but can be taken into conscious perspectives.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, again, looking at bottom-up therapy, where 1 and 3 really speak to that primarily. Number 2 and 4, again, we have to think of the fact that most healing in the case requires a combination of the 3. So that's where I think 2 and 4 come in, where language is the tool of psychotherapy, of top-down therapy, becoming, and that bleeds into bottom-up therapy, because at some point we can't just feel our feelings in the body and expect for them to heal just because we acknowledge that way we feel. We have to pair that with a conscious dialogue and understanding of why it is we feel those ways. And that's kind of what number 2 speaks to. And number 4 speaks to what we've talked about before, where we can manage our external environment. Now, we need to emphasize the importance of the internal environment in this book, but the internal and external environment are equally as important in managing one's stress response, managing one's dealings with trauma, how one deals with trauma. And so
it's kind of a look into what we can do as individuals, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, how we can help the people around us to live better lives. And that's shifting the social environment and the material environment around us to create and facilitate an environment of healing. It comes down to every individual and their ability to enact social change, whether that be kind words or just being there for someone who's going through it. it's incredibly important for the social environment of an individual to be one that is conducive to healing.
Yes. So healing is, as we're continually understanding healing, understanding trauma, its origins, understanding how the brain works, that we've developed newer technology. And again, Kolk was around when this stuff was just emerging, and he's been around when neuroscience began to really take off with the advent of PET, positron emission tomography, and fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance imaging. Those are two forms of scanning the brain and understanding. You can look at the brain when someone's experiencing an event or like experiencing some stimulus, and we can see which parts of the brain light up, and we can kind of have a better understanding of what's going on in the brain based on which regions are lighting up, which regions are being shut off. He says that prior to having people in, before people go into an fMRI, which is what he talks about, they use in this part, they have to inhale radioactive oxygen, because when certain areas of the brain get more active or want to become more active, they have to increase their metabolism. And to do that, they have to upregulate their intake of oxygen. And so if you can see this radioactive oxygen through the fMRI, you can see which parts of the brain light up. That's essentially how it works. And this is a quote by Ivan Pavlov, which you can read here. And we're just going to go ahead and get right into what he was talking about with fMRIs. By experiencing something traumatic or an event that recalled their trauma, that was similar to their trauma, or in Kolk's case, where they would have them get into this fMRI that you can see here, they would slide them in there, and they would speak to them and remind them or put them in an environment, a scenario that was similar to the trauma that they experienced, where, for example, for one person, it was that if you had a tough home life, or like you had unstable parents where they were constantly fighting and physically violent, he recalls to the patient, he recalls a scenario like that, similar to that, and see what parts of the brain are becoming active. And so this is kind of what they found when they did that, they performed those experiments. And something really cool is they found that one, Broca's area, an area responsible for synthesizing our emotions, our feelings into language, gets shut off. So what you can make of that is, in the case of trauma, words, you think about it like in the cliche, like words cannot explain, the horrors I've seen. You can't put these things into words, because your brain, literally, the function of the brain becomes inhibited in the area that is responsible for creating language and being able to relay our feelings and perceptions. But also, so there's that aspect, and there's also the fact that the left hemisphere of the brain was shown to get shut off almost completely, whereas the right hemisphere of the brain seems to activate, seems to light up. It's in alignment with the concept of left brain and right brain. You might hear of people being considered as left brain versus right brain thinkers. And while there's conflicting data, it's showing that, it's not that one side's totally binary. It's not that this side is, the left brain's totally responsible for logic and processing and for acting in a more computed fashion, whereas the right brain is more responsible for intuitive ideas, creative ideas. You can think of the left brain as being more, it's more focused on details, more focused on the in and outs of like your day-to-day life, whereas the right brain is more focused on larger, big pictures, more globalized, unified aspects of things, which might actually go on to highlight how trauma works. Because think about it, if you cannot process things on a from detail to detail on a smaller scale if you can't break things down, how you can't really get to the root cause of things. You can't, you're stuck in this idea that it's this big terrible monster, in this big, okay, well, how do we deal with this monster? Well, we break it down like this, and we go about doing these things, eliminating these things from our lives. Well, you can't go about that process. You just see the monster, and that's one possible way to conceptualize what's happening in the case of trauma.
Right.
Is there anything like about that you thought was really interesting? Because I know the next slide kind of just goes on to talk about that.
Yeah, it's interesting to break down trauma and understand it as the right side of your brain, which is, like you were talking about, designated to emotion. You're not using your left brain, which would allow you to logically understand and rationally put those emotions into a rational box. The Broca's area is off. You're not thinking and intellectually coming to a conclusion that will help you. You're going, use my emotions because my emotions are going to get me out of this event. Our ancestors, if they were sitting down and consciously trying to map out a way to fend off a predator that was attacking them, they would die. You're not using words in that scenario. You're using your emotions, you're using your adrenaline, and you're using that right side of your brain that you're, in terms of an evolutionary perspective, the thing that would help you out of a tumultuous event. So it's interesting to see that we can manifest this process of threat aversion, just sitting in an MRI. They can walk you through, using language, they can walk you through what it was like to be traumatized, and then your brain goes, oh, I'm getting traumatized again, and does the same thing that it did during the event. It's pretty interesting, really.
Yes, it is. And again, like we said before, it isn't that there is no crosstalk between the two hemispheres of the brain. You have a corpus callosum, you have information relaying across the sides. However, this information is interesting because it's interesting to think of the fact, like, why is it that our brains are bifurcated, our cortex is bifurcated the way it is? I kind of talked with you about this. Like, one speculation I have about this is, if you look at the cortex, and it's mainly the cortex that's bifurcated. However, if we get deeper into the brain, we can see, like, in the lower brain, it's just kind of one system. It's kind of one thing. And, like, to think about this symbolically, you think about that lower brain, that reptilian, unconscious brain, animal brain. It's one system because there's no consciousness there. It's acting autonomically, and with no consciousness to distinguish conscious from unconscious, you are, there's a sense of wholeness. And so it's like this ouroboros state of, like, infancy of animality, where you're just acting from one place. You're not a conscious creature, and you're not a conscious creature and an animal. It's just like you're acting totally an animal. Whereas, as we've developed over time, our brains have developed these two aspects of ourselves, to kind of split off consciousness from unconsciousness. We've created this nature of two. I just think that's a very cool way of looking at it. But the symbol, specifically this yin and yang, is like a cool way to think about it too, because you can think about the left brain and the right brain being, the yin and the yang of this. But it isn't that one is totally just different from one another. In fact, they work together in the same system, in this circle. And in fact, there's a little bit of yin in the yang, and there's also a little bit of yang in the yin. So there, like I said, there's crosstalk. There's some in each one, and there's some in each side of it.
Right. Abstract math isn't going to help you in the event of being attacked by another human or a predator. So it makes sense that you would shut it off. But at the same time, a lot of our rational thinking is influenced by emotions, and we need our rational thinking in order to understand emotions on the other end. So they do communicate, but in the case of trauma, um, evolution tells us that we're getting rid of the left side. We're going to use the stuff that we know will get us out of this predicament.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as we see, when it comes to healing, you still need that rationality to help you kind of pull yourself out of that instinctual response.
And that's like the power of Stoic philosophy. It's actually using using humans' capability for a reason to preside over their unconscious tendencies and to become healthier in that sense, become less stressful, and to change your perceptions, direct your actions, and to accept what you can't control, becoming more conscious and reasoned. That's the premise of Stoic philosophy. But we were going back to the fact that Broca's area gets shut off and his right brain is seemingly hyperactive while the left brain's dormant. It's like I said, it's like think about the right brain is like conceptualizing this big, this big monster this dragon we have to slay. Well, it's like, all right, well, how do we slay it? Well, you hit it with a sword. Well, how do you hit it with a sword? Well, you got to find a sword, and you got to strike it this certain way. You got to stab it in this certain place, and you have to sharpen the sword. So it's like you're breaking this down. So the monster is like, the overall goal is hit the dragon. That's the right brain. The left brain's here to tell you, okay, this is how we can go about doing that, how we can deal with that overall idea. It doesn't have to be negative, but it's just like right brain's big thinking, left brain is details and getting down to the nature of things. And what happens is if this left brain shut off, you just see the big dragon. And so trauma, and this is the quote, trauma by nature draws us to the edge of comprehension because we can't comprehend what we're seeing or what we're feeling because this Broca's area is shut off and we have no language or any rationality to process what is happening to us. We can, but in someone who's untrained in that, it's very unlikely that will happen, and it seems impossible.
Right. Yeah, it's so necessary to have someone else help you facilitate that process of comprehension. So a lot of the time while you're essentially, when you're in therapy, you're sitting safely on a couch, no one's going to hurt you. But if you could feel what the individual's feeling, they're experiencing trauma, they're not safe. So you have to have someone to constantly be that voice of reason and allow them to understand that they are in fact safe while they approach the trauma from afar.
Right. And this brings us to the end of the discussion. However, again, when we're looking at trauma, we're looking at how trauma works, the dynamics of trauma. This is where we're beginning to see the neuroscience of it. We're able to look at this physiologically, and that's important because the book, The Body Keeps the Score, is that we're looking into the body and its processes to understand how trauma instantiates itself in the body, and also how we can use the body to heal these psychological lesions.
Exactly.
Is there anything you'd like to conclude with, Landon?
No, not really. I'm excited to, once we have this background knowledge of the way in which trauma impacts us and what causes these neuroses from trauma, and the basics of the psychology behind that. I'm just excited for our next talk, which will be getting into the way in which we can go about facilitating the actual healing.
Yes, and that is the second part of this book that we'll be getting into. So thank you for taking your time and listening, and we hope you enjoyed the talk.
Yep, we'll see you next week.
Yeah.